Today we are going to discuss biogeochemical cycles, that is nitrogen cycle, phosphorus cycle, sulfur cycle, carbon cycle, water cycle and sedimentary cycle. Previously we had discussed biogeochemical cycles, their importance and how they generally work, and what are the general components of the biogeochemical cycles and how they interact with the biotic and abiotic community. That was the brief introduction about that. There are two different biogeochemical cycles which use the two major reservoirs differently. Number one, atmosphere and hydrosphere, and number two, Earth's crust. These reservoirs are also known as nutrient pools, and these are also referred as unavailable pools. They are called unavailable pools not because of the reason that the elements are unavailable, but because there is a very slow flux of the nutrients between unavailable pool and the available pool. The available pool is generally at the surface of the crust or the labile portion of the biogeochemical cycle. The biogeochemical cycles regulate each other, and the examples of this interaction has been discussed in sulfur cycle. Nitrogen cycle is an example of a very complex and well buffered gaseous type. Phosphorus cycle is an example of a simpler, well regulated sedimentary type. In nitrogen cycle, we can see that the reservoir is atmosphere majorly, as we have 80% of the nitrogen in air, while in phosphorus cycle we can easily see that it is of a sedimentary type and major reserves and reservoirs are present in the Earth's crust. Both these elements are often very important limiting factors, or they are controlling the abundance of organisms. The sulfur cycle has an active cycling within and between both pools, and it links between air, water and Earth's crust. Both nitrogen and sulfur cycles illustrate the key role played by microorganisms, and a number of microorganisms are involved in the cycling of nitrogen and sulfur, and there are various complications which are caused by nitrogen and sulfur in the form of industrial pollution. As we all know that nitrogen in the form of nitrates and sulfur in the form of sulfates, if released in the environment, it leads to the problem of eutrophication or acid rains, and that has to be dealt very intelligently. The most important biogeochemical cycles for humanity are carbon cycle and water cycle. Both are characterized by small but very active atmospheric pools that are vulnerable to man-made perturbations or disturbances, which in turn can change weather and climates. A network of worldwide measurements has been established to detect significant changes in carbon dioxide and water. Nitrogen cycle. The nitrogen in protoplasm is broken down from organic to inorganic form by a series of decomposer bacteria. Once a plant or an animal dies and becomes a part of the humus, the same process occurs, and the nitrogen is generally released from these organic to inorganic form by a series of decomposer bacteria. Some of this nitrogen ends up as ammonia and nitrate, the forms most readily used by green plants. The air contains 80% nitrogen and is the greatest reservoir. Nitrogen is continually entering back to the air by denitrifying bacteria and then returned back to the cycle by biofixation or physical fixation. As we have studied in the previous slide, that there is almost 80% nitrogen in the air, and that nitrogen becomes a part of the protoplasm, that with the help of the nitrogen fixing bacteria and algae, which is taken up by the plants, and then the plants are eaten up by the animals, which excrete urea, and their fecal matter. Along with this, some of the animals die and decay in the soil. This excretion and death and decay finally results into the ammonia formation. The ammonia is generally further converted into nitrites due to nitrite bacteria, and nitrites are further acted upon by the nitrate bacteria, which is converted again into nitrates. Nitrates, being a part of the protein synthesis, they convert into protoplasm. The nitrates are generally recycled again and again in the marine and deep sediments and the shallow marine sediments. The nitrates go to the shallow marine sediments, from where they are lost to the deep sediments. However, shallow birds from the marine birds and fish uptake these nitrates, and they are recycled again back to the land. On the other side, if you look at the ammonia is released from the volcanic action of the igneous rocks, and this ammonia enters the nitrogen cycle and further acted upon by the nitrite cycle and nitrite bacteria for the conversion into nitrites, and then nitrate bacteria for the conversion into nitrates. Nitrogen in the air is directly fixed photochemically or through the electrification by lightning and thunder, and this nitrogen is converted into nitrates. What are the major sources of nitrogen for the farmlands? Nitrogen fertilizer, which is almost equal to the nitrogen natural atmospheric fixation, but it is less than biofixation. What is biofixation? Biofixation is the fixation of the atmospheric nitrogen with the help of the legume crops. As legume crops have root nodules in their roots, and these root nodules give residence to the bacteria that convert ammonia into nitrites and then into nitrates. These nitrates are readily taken up by the plants, and the plants grow well, and it becomes a part of the biotic communities. There are different processes which occur within a nitrogen cycle. One is fixation, number 2 assimilation, nitrification, denitrification, decomposition, leaching, runoff, and rain out. These all processes have been mentioned in the next slide, and you can see it that how all these processes occur within a nitrogen cycle. You can see that there is a very large reservoir of nitrogen in the atmosphere, and there are two kinds of fixation. One is biofixation and the other is atmospheric fixation. The nitrogen is fixed by the bacteria and due to legume crops, and it comes into the biotic community. And on the other hand, there is atmospheric fixation, which is because of thunder lights, and that nitrogen is fixed and comes into the form of nitrates. Biotic fixation support the communities, and then when they are eaten up, the plants are eaten up by the animals, they decompose and they release ammonia. That ammonia is used by the nitrifying bacteria, and nitrification occurs at this part, and this nitrification finally results into nitrates. These nitrates are again taken up by the plants, and they are assimilated, and they again cycle in the biotic community. However, these nitrates are also leached off and run off to the reservoir, to the rivers and oceans, and even to the deep sediments. Some of the nitrates are taken up by the fish and birds, and they are returned back to the land. And apart from this atmospheric fixation and biofixation, some of the nitrogen is also added to the terrasphere through rains. So these are the different processes which are occurring within the nitrogen cycle, and we can see it in this diagram. The components of the nitrogen cycle in terms of the energy necessary for the operation of the cycle are mentioned here, and they will be shown in the next slide as well. Number one, the steps from protein down to nitrates provide energy for the organism that accomplish the breakdown, because the protein is being decomposed and finally the nitrates are being formed in the soil. So that is being carried out by various organisms, and these organisms obtain their energy from this breakdown. For example, the chemosynthetic bacteria, nitrosomonas, which convert ammonia to nitrite, and nitrobacter, which converts nitrite to nitrate, obtain energy from the breakdown. This is a energy releasing step. The other step, which is the return step, it is from nitrates to protoplasm, and it requires energy to complete their respective transformations, as we can see it in the next slide. The protoplasm is converted into amino acids, and amino acids are converted into ammonia. Ammonia is converted into nitrite, and nitrites are converted into nitrates with the help of decomposer organisms, and these steps provide energy to these organisms through this breakdown. Then on the opposite side, nitrates are converted into nitrites, and nitrites are converted into ammonia, and ammonia into amino acids, and amino acids into protoplasm, and these are the steps which require energy from other sources, that is the sunlight, or that may be the organic matter. So these are the three perspectives through which we have shown you the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen fixation is an energy expensive process. Much energy is required to break nitrogen to 2 molecules of ammonia with addition of hydrogen from water. So you can take the example of legume nodule bacteria, and these bacteria perform biofixation of 10 grams of glucose of the plant photosynthate, and they fix 1 gram of nitrogen. So you can see they are more efficient as compared to the free living fixers, as the free living fixers require 100 grams of glucose to fix 1 gram of nitrogen. So it is 10 times less efficient as compared to the bacteria which are present in the legume nodule. So what is the reason behind this efficiency? Nodules provides the bacteria an oxygen free environment, and oxygen hinders the process. So it is basically an energy expensive process, due to what a lot of fuel is needed to be expended when we are doing an industrial fixation. This is the reason why nitrogen fertilizer is more expensive than any other fertilizer. So we should be thankful to the nature, because this is what ecological economics tells us, that how we are economically being benefited by the natural processes, and we should respect the nature because that is supporting us for our own life, and this we will be studying in the next slides as well. Genetic engineers are attempting to induce nodule formation in corn, wheat, rice and other major crops for self-fertilizing system, and it would reduce the cost for a farmer, because if more nitrogen fertilizer would be added on a legume crop, it would shut biofixation. Nitrogen fixers are at their best when nitrogen is low in the environment. 10 raised to power 9 metric tons of nitrogen is assimilated each year by global biotic communities. So if there are more animals and plants around, the system of nitrogen fixation will be supported. 80% is recycled from land and water stratum, and 20% is the new input of the necessary nitrogen from the atmosphere and rainouts. Only a very small fraction is added through fertilizers. So, however, even if it is added, most of it is leached out and it runs off, due to what we can say that natural processes are very important for the sustenance of life. As most of the nitrogen we add as nitrogen fertilizers is wasted and it leaches out and it runs off to the natural water bodies that are rivers and oceans and seas, this adds eutrophication to the natural ecosystem, and the efficiency of an ecosystem reduces. So this loss to the water and food can be bad for the human beings. The nitrogen cycle, which have been shown in the previous slides, is a perfect one. However, if you consider a heavily populated area, either of land, freshwater or shallow seas, nitrogen is lost to the deep oceans for millions of years, and a perfect nitrogen cycle may become acyclic because of the mismanagement. This loss is compensated for by nitrogen entering from volcanic gases. As there are volcanic eruptions, there is the discharge of the ammonia as well. We generally think, and the students of ecology and geography generally think, that volcanoes are dangerous for the human habitats, and they affect the life of the human beings. When there are more volcanic eruptions, there are more deaths. However, there is another point of view, that if we cap the world's volcanoes, even if it is technically possible, it might very well cause the death by starvation of more people than it could save from damage by eruptions. So naturally, everything is very important for the survival of the human being on the face of the earth, and they are basically the real bounties of nature. The next cycle is phosphorus cycle. Phosphorus cycle is somewhat simpler than nitrogen cycle, as it has few chemical forms. Phosphorus is an important constituent of the protoplasm, and as a result of the decomposition, it breaks as phosphates, and they are again available to the plants. The major reservoirs of phosphorus are rocks and geological deposits. So basically they are more of the phosphorus cycles belong to sedimentary biogeochemical cycle. Now you can see a phosphorus cycle which has been shown in this figure. We can begin with phosphate rocks, and there are guano deposits and fossil bone deposits, and these phosphate rocks generally erode and they are available as dissolved phosphates. These dissolved phosphates go into shallow marine sediments, from where a fraction is lost to the deep sediments. From shallow marine sediments, marine birds and fish uptake these phosphates, and they again discharge it on the phosphate rocks as guano deposits. These dissolved phosphates, which have been produced as a result of the erosion of the phosphate rocks, are taken up as raw material for the protoplasm synthesis, and this protoplasm of the plants is taken up by the animals through the food chains. These animals generally excrete or are acted upon by the phosphatizing bacteria, or their teeth and bone, they are generally acted upon by different factors, so they return the phosphates back to the dissolved phosphates. So there is a circulation of the phosphates within the ecosystem, and they are being used up by many organisms on the face of the earth, along with human beings. And this is extremely important for the life of the human being because it is a part of the protoplasm. Natural deposits are gradually eroding, due to which the reserves are escaping in the sea part, of which goes to shallow sea and deep sea. The compensation to the loss is inadequate, and no measures have been taken by the human beings in the uplift of the natural reserves, and these natural reserves are being used up by the human beings. The transport of the fish from sea to land is not adequate to replace the phosphorus flowing from sea to land. There is a lot of phosphorus which is being leached out and run off into the oceans, but that balance of nature is not being carried out by the return of those phosphates back to the land. As you all know, phosphates are extremely important in the protoplasm synthesis. These are guano deposits, as we had discussed in our previous slides. These are the deposits of the birds. Seabirds get their food from the sea in the form of fish, and then they excrete their fecal matters, and these deposits are the guano deposits, which are rich in phosphorus, and they are being used up by the human beings. What are the general utilizations of phosphorus? It is important to know that this is being used in fertilizers, gunpowder and explosives, water softeners, pesticides, china wares, and production of steel. And in our everyday use, we light our stoves with matchsticks, and there is a red material on those matchsticks that is basically phosphorus. Seabirds have played apparently an important role in returning phosphorus to the cycle, as you have seen in your previous slide. The transfer of phosphorus and other materials by birds from sea to land is continuing, but the rate is not equal to which it was occurring in the past. Due to this, the phosphorus cycle has become more acyclic, as the human utilization has hastened the rate of loss of phosphorus to the sea. At last, I must mention that the phosphorus reserves are really large, so this is not an immediate concern that these reserves must be conserved. Fertilizers, pesticides, and industrial discharge create severe pollution problems, which is a real concern for the human habitats. Phosphorus must be recycled by using this experimental approach, and that has been proposed many years back, that we can spray wastewater on the upland vegetation, because phosphorus is very important for the growth of the plants, and we can spray this wastewater on the upland vegetation, or we can pass it through natural wetlands instead of throwing it directly to the rivers, because this way we can make our phosphorus cycle more cyclic, and this is how we can conserve our nature as well, for the balance of nature. Sulphur cycle. The large reservoir is in the soil and sediments, while there is a small reservoir is in the atmosphere. So it is a representative of an intermediate form of biogeochemical cycle, which keeps its reservoir in sediments as well as in the atmosphere. Sulfates like nitrates and phosphates is principal available form. Sulfates are reduced by autotrophs and is incorporated into proteins and is an essential constituent of the amino acids. So similarly, we have discussed the importance of nitrogen, the importance of phosphorus, and now sulfur for the presence of life on the face of the earth. Neither the sulfur is required in high amounts, nor it is limiting to the growth of the plants, but it is still important for the plants. You can see this sulfur cycle. There are various oxidation and reduction reactions which go on in this picture, where there is a center wheel-like diagram, and you can see that there is sulfur and there is organic sulfur. The sulfur is being reduced for the production of hydrogen sulfide, and hydrogen sulfide is also converted into iron sulfide, and it is also being oxidized to produce sulfates. As we have discussed in our previous slide, that most of the sulfur is available in the form of sulfates. So sulfates are very important. They are taken up by the plants, or they are basically taken up by the plant roots, and the organic sulfur is reduced to the hydrogen sulfide. This hydrogen sulfide is released to the ocean as gas, and when it is released into the air, it is oxidized and produces sulfates. The sulfates are again directly absorbed by the plants, and these sulfates are also being produced by fuel combustion. So you can see that the sulfates are, when react with water, they produce sulfuric acid, and high pollution of sulfates in the air can lead to acid rains as well. Sulfates are also leached in the anaerobic zone, and there are basically two major zones. One is atmosphere and other is terrosphere. The terrosphere, which is soil and sediments, is again divided into aerobic region and anaerobic region. So this is the area where bacterial population is in higher numbers, and these are mostly anaerobic bacteria. The photosynthetic bacteria are largely aquatic, and in most situations play a minor role in the production of the organic matter, and definitely they are working in the aerobic zone. However, they can function under unfavorable conditions for the general run of the green plants, and they do cycle certain minerals in the aquatic ecosystem. Whereas if you consider the green and purple matter bacteria, they are important in the sulfur cycle. These are obligate anaerobes and are present in anaerobic zone, and they occur in the boundary between the oxidized and reduced zones in sediments or water where there is low light intensity. Tidal mudflats are good places to observe these bacteria, because they form distinct pink or purple layers just under the green layers of the mud algae. In a study of Japanese lakes, it was found that photosynthetic sulfur bacteria accounted for 3 to 5% of total annual production in most lakes, but in stagnant lakes which are rich in hydrogen sulfide, these bacteria accounted for 25% of the total photosynthesis. The non-sulfur photosynthetic bacteria, which are also present in the aerobic zone, they can they also function as heterotrophs in the absence of light, and they can work algae. Bacterial photosynthesis can be helpful in polluted and eutrophic waters, and hence is being increasingly studied, but it is not a substitute for the regular oxygen generating photosynthesis which the world generally depends. The microorganisms are very important for these biogeochemical cycles, as specialized microorganisms play key roles in the rapidly fluxing pool, which we have shown in the previous slide, and that was the center pool where many oxidation and reduction reactions were occurring for the conversion of sulfates to hydrogen sulfide, and hydrogen sulfide to sulfur, and sulfur to sulfate, and hydrogen sulfide again is oxidized to produce sulfate. So this is all being carried out with the help of various microorganisms, and sulfur cycle is a key one in the general pattern of production and decomposition. Microbial recovery from deep sediments resulting from an upward movement of gaseous phase in the form of hydrogen sulfide has also been found very important. We have previously discussed in our initial slides that one biogeochemical cycle impacts the activity of the other biogeochemical cycle. So in this sulfur cycle we can easily see this, that when iron sulfides are formed in the sediments, phosphorus is converted from insoluble to soluble form, and it results in the phosphorus release. Similarly, wetlands are more pronounced in this microbial activity for sulfur release, and these are the important sites for nitrogen and carbon cycling. The photosynthetic bacteria, as we have previously discussed, play a minor role in decomposition. The green and purple sulfur bacteria, which are obligate parasites, are important in sulfur cycle, and they are obligate anaerobes found in the sediments between oxidized and reduced zones with low light intensity. These biogeochemical cycles are the result of interaction of geochemical and meteorological processes. For example, erosion, sedimentation, leaching, rain, adsorption, desorption, and so on, and biological processes, in which we take an example of production and decomposition. Now we will see and discuss carbon cycle. The atmospheric pool is quite small as compared to the oceans and crust. In the atmospheric pool there is very less carbon, that is about 0.03%. Most of the carbon sediments are present in oceans and crust. In oceans they are present in the form of carbonates. However, in the crust they are present in the form of fossil fuels and other storages. Until the beginning of the industrial age, the flow of carbon between atmosphere and continents and oceans was balanced. However, there is a rise in the carbon dioxide in atmosphere due to the anthropogenic stresses. Burning of the fossil fuel, agriculture, and deforestation are the major reasons why there is an increase in the global warming and higher concentration of the carbon dioxide in atmosphere. There are three factors which are major anthropogenic stresses. First is fossil fuels. The burning of the fossil fuels and the process of combustion utilizes oxygen from the air and produces more carbon dioxide. Number two, agriculture. More carbon dioxide is added in the atmosphere than is removed. Carbon dioxide fixed by the crops does not compensate or is not equal to the release of the carbon dioxide through plowing and decomposition. Similarly, removal of the forest reduces carbon dioxide uptake by the plants during photosynthesis, and burning of the wood and oxidation of the humus adds more carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, thereby disturbing the balance of the percentages of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The current concentration and percentage of oxygen and carbon dioxide have developed during the course of time, thereby making conditions favorable for life through evolutionary history. It has been mentioned by Gaia hypothesis over most of the geological time, at least since the beginning of Cambrian period, which was almost 600 million to 1 billion years ago. A very small but significant fraction of organic matter was produced and was incompletely decomposed in anaerobic sediments, or completely buried and fossilized without being respired or decomposed. This excess organic production and over respiration is regarded as a major reason for a decrease in carbon dioxide and build up of oxygen in the atmosphere to high levels of recent geological times, because most of the carbon dioxide was stored in fossil fuels. Thus, evolution and continued survival of higher forms of life became possible. About 300 million years ago, especially, excess production formed the fossil fuels that made the industrial revolution possible on the face of the earth. During the past 60 million years, shifts in biotic balances, coupled with variations in the volcanic activities and rock weathering, sedimentation, solar input, resulted in oscillating steady state in carbon dioxide and oxygen atmospheric ratios. These oscillations in atmospheric carbon dioxide were associated with and presumably caused alternate warming and cooling of the climates. During the past half century, human agricultural and industrial activities have significantly raised the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere, which is a potential reason for the climate alteration, and thereby poses a serious global problem. This figure shows water cycle and carbon dioxide cycle. Figure A shows carbon dioxide cycle, where carbon dioxide is being released from agro-industry and fossil fuels to the biotic and chemical communities, and the discharge goes either to the water or to the atmosphere, from where it is being added into the oceans as carbonates. From atmosphere it goes to the biotic community and to the plants. The plants are absorbing carbon dioxide during the process of the photosynthesis, and the carbon dioxide from highland or uphill is also being lost to the continents. Whereas if you consider the hydrologic cycle in figure B, it shows that certain geograms are there in different parts of the hydrologic cycle. So in ice caps, some of the water is stored in the ice caps and oceans, which are the major reservoirs, and this water is evaporated into the atmosphere, from where where it condenses and falls in the form of rain and taken up by the plants, and the inland water reservoirs are recharged, and some of it goes to the lithosphere. So this is the whole cycle of the water. Hydrological cycle or water cycle is very simple as compared to the other three we have previously discussed. In water cycle, water is converted into vapors using solar energy, and those vapors are then condensed into rain droplets and is returned back to the land. The first part is basically energy consuming process, where the energy is obtained from the solar system, and the latter part is energy releasing process, in which we get energy and we convert that energy into hydroelectric powers. For this purpose, we are also establishing and constructing dams, and there are certain ecological problems of dams in this perspective as well, as far as the geochemical cycles are concerned. However, water cycle is a process which is being appreciated quite less, and when we study the process in terms of the ecological economics, it provides us various services in very cheap cost. This is a diagram. This is a figure which shows energetics of the hydrologic cycle, and there are two loops. One is uphill loop, in which solar energy is required for the conversion of water into vapors, and these vapors are then condensed into clouds. The clouds then release the energy by dropping rain, and this energy is useful for doing various tasks, as we have discussed previously, and we have used this energy in hydroelectric power generation as well. There are various benefits of the water cycle, and in many areas of the world, due to this water cycle, the underground water is recharged, and however, still the water is being pumped out at a very high rate in certain parts of the world, so the rate of discharge is not equal to the rate of recharge, due to what the water cycles are also becoming acyclic in certain parts of the world. Most water evaporates from sea and returns to the land by rainfall, and human activities increased the rate of runoff of water, and one of the major reason is the metalling of the roads and pavements of the earth over earth. So and secondly, diking and ditching the rivers, and agricultural soils, deforestation. These all activities reduce the recharge of the underground water. This is a figure which shows a river continuum, and how there are changes in the community metabolism, diversity and particle size from headwater streams to large rivers. We can take the example of the river Indus in Pakistan. There are headwaters, there are midsections, and there are lower reaches. As you can see here, the headwaters are mostly heterotrophic in nature, and midsections are mostly autotrophic in nature, and lower reaches are again heterotrophic in nature. The mean particle size is very high in the headwaters, and the mean particle size reduces a lot in the lower reaches, due to what the light penetration is also affected, leading to the reduction in the production over respiration ratio, and in the lower reaches the water becomes more muddy, and light penetration reduces, and production of respiration is also reduced as compared to the midsection area, thereby leading to the heterotrophic mode of life. Biotic communities adjust to the changing conditions of the river continuum, gradient from small to large streams. In headwater section, the general features are that the area is smaller and narrower as compared to the mid-water section. It is mostly shaded and little light is available. So, more heterotrophic form of life is present. Primary productivity is mostly organic detritus and it is mostly leafy, due to what the consumers are generally shredders and they depend on organic material such as leaf particles. Production over respiration ratio is very less than 1 and biotic diversity is also less in head sections as compared to the mid sections of the river. In the mid section, the general features are that they are wider, they are not shaded, and they depend less on the imported organic matter, due to what the form of life is mostly autotrophic and algae and macrophytes are present in the wider section and mid section of the river. Due to this, the consumers are mostly filter feeders and they have collector adaptations. The mouth parts are mostly net-like and strainers. The PR ratio is comparatively greater in the mid section as compared to the headwater section, and biotic diversity is also increased in the mid-water section as compared to the headwater section. In the lower section, the speed of the current is quite reduced, the particle size is quite small, due to what water becomes more muddy and the light penetration is a bit less, and aquatic photosynthesis occurs. However, the form of life is mostly heterotrophic. Primary productivity in headwater section is less than that of the mid section, which is greater than that of the lower section. Consumers are generally heterotrophic. Production over respiration ratio in headwater section is less than that of the mid section, which is greater than that of the lower reaches, and biotic diversity is comparatively low, which is almost similar to the headwater section. However, the nature of the species might be different, but diversity is almost similar to that of the headwater section. Sedimentary biogeochemical cycle. Most elements like granite, basalt are more earthbound as compared to nitrogen, carbon dioxide, water, sulphur and phosphorus even, and they follow a basic sedimentary cycle pattern as under erosion, sedimentation, mountain building, volcanic activity, and then with the availability of these elements on the surface of the earth, they are biologically transported, a very important and effective mode of circulation. As you can see here, there is basalt and granite, which is mostly near to the mantle, and with the help of natural fallouts, they are generally released in the air, and due to certain volcanic activities and erosion, they are released onto the crust, where sedimentation occurs, and finally mountain formation happens, and then these are further utilized by the organisms on the face of the earth. As hypothesized by Gaia hypothesis, individual organisms not only adapt to the physical environment, but by their concerted action in the ecosystem, they also adapt the geochemical environment to their biological needs. Now there is a concept of material spiraling. Material spiraling takes place in the ecosystem, and it is supported by the biotic communities. In aquatic ecosystems, organisms are not just adapters to the gradient of changes, they also reduce downstream loss of nutrients to the ocean. They move nutrients upstream or out on the watershed as a part of their life cycle, through a process of material spiraling. There are two forms of material spiraling: uphill material spiraling and lowland material spiraling. The guano deposits, as we had discussed in the phosphate cycle, is an example of uphill material spiraling, where phosphorus is taken from the sea and it is again settled on the islands or lands. Uphill material spiraling is the return of nutrients back to the uphill region. For example, the salmons migrate from marine to freshwater ecosystem for material spiraling, as after spawning and their death, they return the nutrients back to the uphill region. The process of mineral spiraling is hindered by the construction of the dams, and it is further aggravated by timber cutting, contributing to the impoverishment of uplands' nutrient pools. Lowland mineral spiraling. The sudden rush of materials into the lowlands resulting from human accelerated erosion does not necessarily benefit the lowland ecosystem, which may not get a chance to assimilate the nutrients before they pass into the sea beyond the range of light and thus out of the biological circulation. We can easily understand that if we would be planting more trees, if there would be more vegetation cover, the speed of the water would be less and there would be less erosion of the topsoil. And this topsoil, if wasted or if erodes to the oceans, it not only takes the topsoil, it also brings many nutrients into the sea. So, reducing the mineral spiraling or thereby producing its bad effects on the natural ecosystem. The chemical elements available to the communities tend to accumulate in the rocks. Elements abundant in the mantle are scarce at the surface and affects biotic communities. For example, scarcity of phosphorus at the surface limit the growth of the plants. The next part of the sedimentary biogeochemical cycle tells about the movement of the solid through air, and it is called fallout. Fallout are of two types. One is natural fallout, which occurs through volcanoes, dust storms or forest fires. And if you consider these fallouts for the mineral spiraling, they bring the material down from the earth onto the surface of the earth. And similarly, if there are forest fires, the nutrients are basically given back to the surface of the earth. And in comparison, if you consider the timber cutting and the usage of that timber by the human beings, it means that the nutrient spiraling will be slow in the uphill region. Human induced fallout are radioactive fallouts. These fallout lead to the climate change, and we have always been studying global warming and the greenhouse gases which cause greenhouse effect, finally leading to the increase in the temperature of the atmosphere. There is also a global cooling effect, and that global cooling is because of the fallouts, because these small particles, they block the solar radiation and reduce the atmospheric temperature. Estimated annual flow of sediments from continents to oceans is maximum in Asia because of intensive population pressure. The land is being cleared for the utilization by the human beings, either for their construction or for the agricultural purposes. Due to that, there is more soil erosion, there is more loss of the nutrients. Lowlands and oceans tend to gain soluble or usable mineral nutrient at the expense of this uplands activity when there is minimal geological activity. The geological activity provides the nutrients by shifting them from mantle to crust. So once the nutrients are available at the surface, they must be recycled by local biological mechanisms, because this way downhill loss will be under control. The longer vital elements can be kept within an area and used over and over again by successive generations of organisms, and the less new material will be needed from outside. So it is very important that we should conserve the biodiversity of a region, and especially we should plant more trees and forests, so that the recycling of these vital elements can be kept within a particular area, and there should be less soil erosion and less loss of these vital elements to the lowlands and oceans, because otherwise it would be difficult for the natural systems to carry out mineral spiraling. This is all about the different biogeochemical cycles and their importance, and the relationship between with biotic communities and abiotic systems. If you have any questions, you may ask it on the same forum. Thank you so much.